It's time again for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
And I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And we're the Insiders. Chuck, just recently, a Dane County judge overturned Act 10, Scott Walker's collective bargaining reforms, that really changed a government in Wisconsin. Those have now been overturned by this lower court, but that's certainly something that's going to work its way up through the courts here in this state, one way or another. And a lot of people think it's going to affect the race for Supreme Court. What say you?
You know, I think the anticipation of it impacting the Supreme Court, I think, is greater than what it will actually do. But it is a very significant piece of legislation, and people will, and certainly there will be a lot of money spent on it. I think what's going to happen with the Supreme Court race is that with a very different electorate in the spring, and with people who are concerned about, the teachers that are they're having a hard time getting into their districts. I really think that the Act 10 impact, which was tremendous back when it was enacted and right before it and right after it, it was huge. I think that that is kind of dissipating in terms of people's attitudes. What I've seen is like Wisconsin was like third in school spending back in the days before Act 10. We've now dropped into the mid 30s, so we are well below average. I think that, and people are school districts, I know because I talked to some of these school district administrators and principals, are having a hard time keeping people in Wisconsin. There's talk that people that are educated here in Wisconsin as teachers are going over to Minnesota and other places because they can get better pay. So I don't think it's going to have the same impact that it's had in the past, even in Supreme Court races. I do believe that you're going to see again a matchup of a strong progressive person and a very conservative person. And I think we saw this movie a year ago, and I don't think that I know there'll be a lot of money spent on it, but I think the dynamics are different now. When this initially happened, people were concerned that teachers were doing so well and they're maybe too well in their communities and blah blah blah. Now people see what happens when you pay in the bottom half of the pay grade across the country. You start seeing that teachers, you just can't attract them. I mean, it's not like people don't have other options. Especially women used to be kind of this captured labor force that we could put into teaching. That's not the case anymore. They can do anything they want to do. And that's a good thing, but it means you have to be more competitive in terms of teacher salaries. So I think that actually the public view and the view of insiders, even many insiders, that this is going to be the dominant force in this race, I think is misplaced, although it will certainly be talked about a lot during the election.
Well, I think, this is another example of where we're beginning to see in too many courtrooms, I think in Wisconsin, that politics is trumping justice. There's a great concern, I know on our side, that that's what's happening on the Supreme Court in Wisconsin already, that the decisions being made on a political basis rather than on the law or judicial basis. But you had a judge here in Dane County who signed Scott Walker's recall petition, who says, no, I'm objective about all of Scott Walker's reforms. And then he overturns it. He overturns it on the grounds of the fact that police and fire were not included in the collective bargaining reforms, even though that question has already been litigated and been decided by state and federal courts and found to be constitutional. But no, some smart guy in Dane County has concluded, unlike the state Supreme Court and unlike the federal courts, he says it's unconstitutional. To me, that just reeks of politics. And I think that's what to any extent that it bleeds into the Supreme Court race, that is one extent. It will help Judge Schimmel make his case to the Wisconsin Supreme Court as starting to make these decisions based upon politics rather than the rule of law. And so I think that's helpful to him. It could be helpful in what is a lower turnout election for what remains of the government unions in Wisconsin, for those government employee unions to turn their people out and say, hey, we want to make sure that we have a friendly Supreme Court for when this Dane County judge's decision works its way up the ladder to the state's highest court. But I think in general, I agree with you that the extraordinary emotion that we saw in 2011 and 12 around Act 10 has dissipated. And I would argue it's because the world didn't fall apart, which is what we were told would happen when Act 10 passed by the left. It was just doom and gloom. Everything's going to be horrible. And I think people look around and they're like, yep, I'm still paying taxes and government's still working. So I just don't think I think the emotion has been sucked out of it, but it could affect turnout and it could affect the message in the Supreme Court race.
I think what's happened here, and let's be honest about it, the Democrats' position is that exactly what Scott said happened, but it happened well before Act 10. And what happened was the Supreme Court majority became not just a conservative majority, but a Republican majority. And they decided, for example, that Scott Walker, when he made the strong political decision to exclude police and fire, I mean, this whole idea that, oh, hey, we're going to knock out the teachers and the AFSCME people, but we're not going to take on the police. That was a totally political decision. Everybody understood that that's the way it was. And what we've seen now is that the rhetoric at the Supreme Court has gotten just ugly. For an attorney to see the comments that are being made by the Republican conservative minority in Wisconsin and the aggressive attacks on the credibility of their own court is deeply disturbing to people in who are lawyers and who are in the even in the judiciary. I've talked with circuit court judges both in and outside of Dane County who are very concerned about the rhetoric that's going on. So I think the court has been politicized, but I think at the end of the day here, if you look at this, we go back, and Scott is right, it is voting on emotion. I still believe, even though it was muted in the presidential race, what's going to be more important to the people of Wisconsin, especially the women of Wisconsin, is abortion in this election and with this smaller electorate. I think people will be surprised at the end of the day by the margin that in this spring smaller electorate, the margin that will be gotten by the woman who will be running as the progressive versus the conservative of Schimmel. And I think a lot of it will turn on abortion. I think people believe after the Trump race that was not as big a factor. It wasn't. And I was a little surprised at that. But I think in this different electorate you'll see in the spring, I think that this, even though people think Act 10 is the big deal, that's not going to be the big deal in the spring. That, in comparison to abortion, I think will be, I think abortion will be a much bigger issue.
So I'm not a lawyer, but I am a lawmaker, or I was. And as I understand it, you just have to have a rational distinction for excluding someone from a law provision. And we do it for police and fire all the time. We do it in the pension system in Wisconsin. They're set aside separate because there's a higher risk for all those people for injury or death. We do it in other sorts of laws. There's penalty enhancers in the law for assaulting a police officer or assaulting a firefighter. We make this distinction all the time because we recognize how difficult and how different those two professions are. I just don't know how the judge could have overturned it on this basis, or how the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin can get to that. But regardless, I think
Scott,
yeah,
Scott makes a good point. I think that many of these issues should not be in the Supreme Court. They should be decided legislatively. But I'll tell you what, when the system is skewed, when there's a deep and dark redistricting or gerrymander, where 67% of the vote can go for Democrats across the state, and they only get 30-some percent of or 30-some% of the seats are held by Democrats, when they got 55% of the vote. When things like that are happening, it changes the system. The system, the great genius of our forefathers, was to put in place an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. If one branch does not perform its functions correctly, there will be a reaction in the system. By the way, being an attorney and a former legislator like Scott, I am disturbed by the things that have happened to our system. But when something in this process gets extremely out of whack, the other elements of the system, the other branches of government tend to react to that. And by the way, that started with the gerrymandering that happened after 2010. And I'll tell you what, yes, there are some things here which I would look at and say, maybe some different consideration. But the reality is when you have that crazy a situation going on, you're not going to see the other branches not react. And that was the genius of our forefathers. And I think that's what you're seeing.
Well, we might disagree about this particular issue, but I think we do agree that elections have consequences and that this next Supreme Court election is going to have huge consequences for policy going forward in the state of Wisconsin.
That's absolutely correct. See you next time.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.